Tēnā koutou, ko waio, I tipu aki aho I te tarangi, ke te noho no o ki te raki pai whenua, ke Harbour Sport aho, e mahi ana, ko Emily toku ingoa. Thank you very much for being with us today. We'll just start things off with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te iru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Awesome, so I've got my amazing colleague Asanati with me here today as well, so I'll just let her introduce herself and go through the agenda for today.
Cool. Talofa lava everyone, Māori, whakalofalahi atu, maloelele, Bulavanaka. Congratulations to the Fiji team that won the sevens last night. Olo ingo Asanati, wa ole Pacific Community Manager I Harbour Sport, o ki saumalingu o sungai I Upolu. E whaftaile tua wa mailene ava noa e whaetas whutanga ma I umale manuia. So greetings everyone, my name is Asanati. I'm the Pacific Community Manager here at Harbour Sport and also co-lead with M, our women and girls space. So it's great to have everybody here today. So I'm just heading into our agenda today. So we're going to start off with, we've just started off our opening. We've got what is gender equity, and then status of gender equity, why GE matters and why are we here, what can we do to change, and then we'll head into our question and answers, and then I'll close it off. So it'll be a great webinar. So welcome everyone.
Awesome, so we'll just go into the housekeeping ground rules. So please mute your microphone, please turn off your videos. If you have any questions, use the chat function or the raise hand signal. We'll endeavour to go for an hour and 30 max. And just remember, this is a knowledge building webinar, so take notes, ask questions, and please be present with us. So we're lucky enough to have Jenny Lim here with us this morning from Canadian Women in Sport. So I'll pass it over to her to introduce herself and kick things off.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. Great. So tēnā koutou, ko waio, I tipua ki aho I Malaysia, ke te noho o ki Toronto. Hey, Canadian Women in Sport aho e mahi ana, for Jenny Lim toku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, it's my pleasure today to be able to spend some time speaking with you about engaging women and girls in the sports system. So before I get started, I just want to take a moment to connect with the land that I'm currently on. Of course, we're really fortunate today with the technology that we're able to gather virtually from across the globe, and but we want to recognize the original occupants of the places where we reside, especially as we're gathered with the intention to share knowledge, which in many countries is a practice that has been intentionally restricted in Indigenous communities for a long time. So I'm currently based in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as our webinar today is hosted by the good people at Harbour Sport, I also want to take this time to acknowledge mana whenua of Te Raki Pai Whenua or North Shore. Here in Canada, we know that Indigenous women and girls are underrepresented in sport and that they face many barriers to participation, right, at all levels that is not only serious in its own, but also compound with the gender inequities that exist in sport. So it's our intention at Canadian Women in Sport that we continue to build relationships that will allow us to better address this gap through our work. And as a settler myself, formerly in New Zealand and now a newcomer in Canada more recently, I've personally benefited greatly from the richness and the opportunities of the land that I've lived on. So we must all acknowledge that we have a role to play in upholding the principles of the treaties that cover the land that we're on. And for many of you today, that would be the principles of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which are participation, partnership, and protection. So as we go into our session today, I just invite you to reflect on those principles, as well as how they may apply to your role in sport and to society more broadly. So thank you again for joining me today. I'm Jenny Lim. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a Malaysian-born Kiwi living in Toronto in Canada. I can't sit still, clearly. And so some of you may remember me from my time at Harbour Sport, where I led the activation program. And I've been really fortunate since moving to Canada almost 3 years ago to have joined a growing team at Canadian Women in Sport as a program manager, where my role is predominantly focused on developing gender equity solutions and working closely with sport and rec organizations at all levels, from NSOs to community clubs to advance gender equity. If you don't know who we are at Canadian Women in Sport, we're a national multi-sport organization, and our aim is to create an equitable and inclusive Canadian sports system that empowers girls and women, not only as active participants, but also as leaders within and through sport. We're trying to do many things. And our focus really is on systemic change, which means we're not in the business of changing or fixing women and girls, but we partner with governments, organizations, and leaders in the sports sector to challenge the status quo around the sports system, around gender equity and inclusion, and more importantly, to provide solutions that result in measurable change. So now it would be really amazing for me to hear from you using the chat function. We're going to get your fingers warmed up and using the chat. So I know that you've joined from all over New Zealand, some of you joining from Canada. So if you can share in your chat, so finding the chat box at the bottom there, some of you might be finding it in the 3 dots and clicking on chat. And if you can share your name, your pronouns, if you're comfortable sharing that, and where you've joined us from, whether it's in New Zealand, wherever you're joining us from. And then it will be also great if you can share one word that describes how you're feeling right now. Okay, so I'll give everyone some time to find the chat box and your name, pronouns, your organization, where you're joining us from, and then one word to describe how you're feeling. Great, it's rolling in. Awesome. Kia ora, Sophia, Trudy, Luciana, nice to meet you. Sarah, Laura, nice to see you. Awesome, tired but passionate. Yeah, my one word, if it's right now, it's about dinner time here in Toronto. And if you know me from Harbour Sport, you're probably not surprised to hear that I'm feeling hungry. Always hungry, still eating lots all the time. Awesome. Hi, Jenna. Sophie. Hi, Sophie. Auckland, Waikato, Christchurch. Great. North Shore, all over New Zealand. That's awesome. Great, keep them coming. Have a scroll through if you like. If you're sick of hearing my voice for a little bit, have a look through and see who else is here with us today. Puppy Golf Club, awesome. I actually, in New Zealand, my family home is across the road from Pupuki Golf Club. So my dad's probably there right now as we speak. Okay, great. Keep them coming. So wonderful to meet you all today, and so great to also see some familiar names and faces earlier on when we had our cameras on. So before we talk about gender equity or engaging women and girls, how we will achieve gender equity, let's talk about what we mean when we say gender equity. What does that mean? And we often hear the terms gender equality and gender equity being used interchangeably when we're describing our work. So we always use this diagram here to describe and illustrate the difference between equality and equity, and it's something that we've adapted from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So on the left there, you can see that equality focuses on creating the same starting line for everyone, right? So everyone's given the same tools, same opportunities, same levels of resources, and that's illustrated here in this picture as everyone being given the same bicycle, and that's great that they all have bicycles, but it's regardless of their needs or who they are. Equity, on the other hand, has the goal of providing everyone with the full range of opportunities and benefits that might be needed to redress some historical imbalances or inequities that may have existed in the system. So certain groups or peoples may need a disproportionately high level of investment or resources so that they can achieve the same level of engagement as other groups, and these other groups may have been privileged within the system, right? So an intentional effort is required. And we often hear in conversations, and I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with this, is that, you know, we offer the same programming to girls and boys, or our job postings are available across our entire network. So on our website, anyone can apply if they are good enough or if they meet the criteria, right? So But we know that an act of gender equity recognizes that there are many biases, often unconscious biases, that exist against women and girls, as well as people from equity-seeking groups that still exist in today's society. So we know that gender-neutral decisions in the sports sector specifically can and often yield gender inequitable outcomes. So an active strategy and intention is often required to combat these barriers and biases for certain people groups. And it's also important to note that we can't achieve true gender equity without taking an intersectional approach. So intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which describes sort of the consideration of an individual's simultaneous identities beyond gender, things like their race, their age, disability, education levels, and so on. And often we take an oversimplistic approach of comparing the experiences of men and women or boys and girls. We tend to overlook the unique experiences or oftentimes overlapping inequities, right, that are being experienced by, for example, women of color, trans women, women with disabilities, for example. So ensuring that we keep intersectionality front of mind and continue to seek understanding of the lived experiences of all individuals will be really important in achieving gender equity. So on that note, throughout our presentation today, we'll be referring to women and girls throughout the webinar today. And we want to make space and make sure that that includes anyone who self-identifies as a girl, a woman, transgender, genderqueer, making space for non-binary folks, and other underrepresented gender identities as well. So let's hear from you again. I'm going to launch a poll shortly for you to answer this question. So thinking about the organization that you're affiliated with, whether you're a staff member, you're a leader in the organization, or maybe you're just a member of the club, how important is gender equity in your organization? Okay, from your perspective. So if you're not leading or a staff member in the organization, you might not know, but from your perspective, how important is gender equity in your organization? So not at all, or that you've had conversations about gender equity, but you don't have the capacity to address it, or that you've started taking some steps towards advancing gender equity, or whether gender equity is prioritized and well-resourced in your organization. Okay, so launching the poll right now, and we'll leave it on for about a minute or so while I have a look through the slides. Yep, we will share the slides with you afterwards. Danielle, yes, that's my dad. Oh, obvious, he is there every day, isn't he? He's playing tomorrow. I'm gonna take a screenshot of this. This is hilarious. Awesome. Great. So about 60% of you have voted, so I'll leave it on for a few more minutes for you. I know some of you have a few people in one room, so you might want to come up with a consensus, some deep discussions to start off your day today. Hi, Roger. Good to see you again. You're cold. Right. This is a rare moment in the year where I'm in Toronto and hot, and you're in New Zealand and it's cold. Not going to complain. Okay, awesome. All right, leave it on for another 5 seconds. So if you haven't submitted your response, you have 5 seconds to do so. 3, 2, 1, and we're ending our polling. Okay, so here are the results. Really great to see that a big percentage, almost a quarter of you show that gender equity is prioritized and well-resourced in your organization. That's really awesome. Most people, more than half, have started taking some steps towards advancing gender equity, and a small percentage have had conversations, haven't had the capacity to address it, and a tiny fraction where it's not at all. So that's awesome to know, and really promising. And I've been obviously following really closely in the happenings in New Zealand around gender equity, and really heartened to see that there's a lot of promising steps towards addressing a lot of the historical imbalances. So one question that we hear all the time in our work that we do is, what about the boys? What about the men? You know, why are we focusing just on women and girls and addressing their needs, right? And it's because women and girls are consistently underrepresented at all levels of sport. And not only that, women and girls experience many unique barriers and inequities that boys and men don't, or experience to a lower degree. The other element too is considering intersectionality, that if there are more compounding inequities, then the gap is larger, right? So I'm going to share a small snippet from a recent report that we published in 2020, which showed that this is in Canada, that 1 in 3 girls has dropped out of sport when they're 16, compared to 1 in 10 boys of the same age. And 82% rather of women and girls between the ages of 16 and 63 don't participate in sport weekly. And this is, of course, a research conducted in Canada. So I'm going to hand you over to Emily and Asanati again to share some really interesting insights from New Zealand.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. So we'll start off in terms of the leadership space. So we've got a snippet here. It highlights high performance coaching is 70% males and 30% females. There's a really good example of this through the Tokyo Olympics, where 211 athletes competing at the Games has gone along, and there are a minimum of 62 male coaches and only 4 women coaches. So that's a real life example that's happening today. If we look in terms of leadership and management, 60% male, 40% female. And then admin and support services, 22% male and 76% female. So there's definitely a disparity between men and women in terms of their roles in decision making. Cool. And then next we'll look at value and visibility. So this report was published actually April this year. So while we're doing better, 15% of all coverage is women's, 83% is men. We were chatting about this before actually, and Jenny said that in Canada and the US, 4% is women's sport. So obviously our scale is a lot smaller, but we're definitely taking steps in the right direction. In terms of the top 5 sports, they account for 72% of all of the coverage, and 7% of that is female. So that just gives you a snippet on the value and visibility side. And then lastly, we'll touch on participation. So we all know that females are participating less than their male counterparts. So young males spend 96 more minutes each week being physically active than young females, and females have more barriers than males when facing this. So I'll pass on to Asanati, and she'll kind of delve a bit deeper into that, into the concept of intersectionality, where we'll look at participation in terms of disability and ethnicity as well.
Well, thanks, Em. So just, spotlight on the disability. So as you can see there, the disabled young females participate in fewer sports and activities than non-disabled females, as do disabled adults there. And so going into our Pacific, so what I do here at Harbour Sport is we run a program called Equipped. So, there's disability, but there's also, when Jen talks about intersectionality, there's also the cultural lens. So Equipped focuses on Pacific young women in the high schools and in the intermediates. And one of the things there we've found also is that just focusing on the stats there. Sorry, Jen, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Just focusing on the young Pacifica women space, if you can see there, 15% reporting significant symptoms of depression and 29% reporting they had deliberately harmed themselves. So within our schools, we've got these young women that come from, all sorts of backgrounds. And what we've found is a lot of them also have things outside of school that they deal with. So for example, they're the older siblings looking after the younger siblings, one parent income. So they have things that they deal with. So that stops them from participating in certain things, but it's that whole seeking understanding from your young woman that are in these particular programs. So it's, they've got church commitments, they've got, like I said, they're looking after their younger siblings, and also they work part-time. And if you go into the universities as well, that's the same thing. So participating in sports is a real issue for them because of those particular things that come in. And then the Active New Zealand survey, as you can see there, by ethnicity, young and adult Asian have lower levels of weekly participation and spend less time being physically active. Young Māori continue to spend more time in organised participation, 5.2 hours compared with 4.6 hours for all children and young people. They also spend above average time in informal participation per week, so 7.5 hours compared with 6.5 hours for all children and young people. Adult Māori and Pacific have lower levels of weekly participation and spend less time being physically active. And adult European females have higher levels of weekly participation than male counterparts. So even within that intersectionality, it's taking into account all those different things with disability, culture, and then you've just got to be mindful of who you're working with in your spaces. And I'll hand it back to Jen.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Nati and Emily. So if anyone needs convincing, a lot of great stats from Sport New Zealand and the Harbour Sport to share, and it becomes really stark when you really look into the numbers, especially looking deeper than the numbers, right? Like what Nati shared, there's a lot of experiences or barriers, concerns, challenges that are experienced by women and girls and with intersecting identities that we really need to be aware of. On top of this being a really pressing gap to address, we also know through extensive research that gender equitable and inclusive organizations do better, right? You always hear about not only is it the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. I have a few examples here that I'll highlight, but there's a link at the bottom of the screen there with an extensive list of these that cover different areas of the organization that you can refer to. So one of the first ones is that gender equitable and inclusive organizations are as much as 158% more likely to understand target consumers and audiences. And in sport, this is particularly important because there are multiple factors that having a good understanding of your target audience can positively impact your sport organization. So more effective marketing to recruit girls and women, more effective programming to retain girls and women, and also having athletes who feel welcome in an organization or in an environment. We also know that gender equitable and inclusive organizations perform better financially and have access to more diverse funding streams. A balanced number of women and men on boards expands innovation by ensuring that there are more than one perspective being considered, particularly when you are faced with complex decisions. And more importantly, and I know 99% of the organizations that I work with in Canada, and I think very similar in New Zealand as well, is that dropout rate is a real concern, right? And I presented that stat a little bit earlier on. And research shows that prioritizing gender equity can decrease dropout rate for girls and women. And this is done via gender-friendly guidance and coaching, avoiding sexist gender stereotypes, and creating a positive and social atmosphere. Again, there's that list there that you can access. So how did we end up here? And often when we think about gender equity or engaging women and girls, we go straight to participation numbers. So how many girls play and don't play our sport? So naturally, our solution focuses a lot on participation opportunities, right? So let's get as many girls as we can through the door, which is great. And having a lot of opportunities for women and girls is really important in engaging them. But we should also be aware that gender equity isn't just about the numbers. It's also about representation. It's also about retention, experiences, policies, safety, and many more factors. So when we observe gender equity at the participation level, it's often the symptom of various inequities that exist at multiple levels of the sports system. So you can see on the screen here an ecological model, which isn't new, but it proposes that there are multiple factors at all levels of the sport ecosystem in this case that affects who belongs and who stays and who leaves the sport system. So you can see at the individual level, the center of the circle there, you have things like personal decisions, likes and dislikes, attitudes of decision makers in sport. There's also an interpersonal element there, right? So it's sort of like what parents decide for their children. I know through my work at Harbour Sport, we did a lot of work with parents specifically. There's also things like who are the coaches or relationships that exist within a sport club or a team. And then at the organizational level, which we'll focus a little bit more on today, are things like who makes the decisions, who does selection, who is on your selection committee, funding allocation, your policies, what policies do you have, and what the quality is of those policies, your programs, et cetera, many things that can be considered at the organizational level that can affect who belongs in the sports system. And then you have the sectoral level, where you have things that are typical or acceptable within the sports system, or traditions and histories that are related to your sport. And then you have the societal level, where you're affected by things like government policies, how sport is funded in a country, media representation. Em shared some really great stats around how diabolical the gender inequity is in media representation in sport. And so many multifaceted compounding factors that result in gender inequity. And so when we think about the solutions, we need to take a whole of system and a holistic approach to finding those solutions, and to make sure that they're not one-offs, and to make sure that they are sustainable. And at the core of inequity are biases, and usually unconscious biases that exist within all levels of the sports system. Just really quickly touching on unconscious bias, I'm sure this is not a new concept for many of you. It's a sort of a mental shortcut, right, that occurs automatically as your brain makes quick judgments based on things like your past experience, your background, what you see in the media, for example. And we all have it, right? It's not something that only bad people have. It's an implicit association or attitude that operates beyond our control and awareness. But it's really important for us to become consciously aware of them, because it not only informs our perception of a people or a social group, and it helps us form sort of preconceived ideas about people in certain situations, but more importantly, it can really influence our decision-making, right? And you can imagine someone who holds a lot of decision-making power in the sports system, their unconscious biases, while it could be small and unconscious, it can have a great impact. Especially towards the target of that bias. Just a few examples of the types of unconscious biases that women generally face in the workplace, right? And this is from our website, or a resource on our website, but it's sourced from the Lean In resource here. So one of the types of biases are performance bias. So where women tend to receive less recognition for their success, but they receive more blame for failure. Attribution bias, where women tend to receive less recognition for their success. The performance bias is where women tend to be underestimated while men are overestimated. And then that was attribution bias that I first described there. And then likability bias, and this one grinds my gears because I've absolutely heard this comment made towards me, where women may be described as aggressive, where men will be described as assertive for the exact same behavior. And I'm sure a lot of women nodding their heads around the table today. And then maternal bias, where women may be dismissed for opportunities because of assumption of their commitment to their career due to motherhood. And we see this in coaching. We often hear this, where people aren't considered for coaching opportunities, especially at a high performance level, because of assumptions about what they want to do. So you can see more information about unconscious bias at leanin.org, and the link again is at the bottom of the screen there. So get your chat boxes ready, because I have a few questions on unconscious bias for you to answer in the chat. So the first question here is, how much more likely do you think are women than men to plan on leaving the workplace to focus on family? So let your unconscious biases run wild, embrace it. And don't be shy, put your answer in the chat. So it could be a percentage, 100%. Women are more likely than men to plan on leaving the workplace. Any more guesses? Thanks for being brave, Liz. 100% more likely, 95% more, definitely more likely, much more likely, 50%. Okay, great, keep them coming. Way more likely, Awesome. So almost always. Great. Give a few more people, much more likely. Yeah, awesome. Okay, my partner is going to leave to look after our future kids. Yeah. And so ready for the answer? The answer is actually there's virtually no difference. And again, if you go on Lehman's website, they source the source of this piece of research, where women and men plan on leaving to focus on family at similarly low rates, at about 2%. Right, but there's always a perception that women are always more likely to leave, and maybe it's always more likely to be a consideration. But actually planning on leaving the workplace, we see through research that there's virtually no difference. Okay, ready for another one? These are always fun and very eye-opening. So in a study, you can see how bitter I am about this unconscious bias here. Is in a study of performance reviews, what percentage of women receive negative feedback on their personal style, such as, you can sometimes be abrasive? And the second question, at what percent of men, and what percentage of men receive that same type of feedback? So you can put 2 percentages in the chat to answer that. So in a study of performance reviews, what percentage of women receive negative feedback, and what percentage of men receive that same type of feedback? Yep, 70 versus 10, 75 versus 10, 0 and 0. Great, much more varied this time. It was very consistent that last round. 10%, 10%. Okay, any more? Okay, 30 and 5, 80 and 20. Okay, great. Answers coming. And the answer is 66% of women and only 1% of men receive that same type of feedback. And so that goes back to that likability bias, where the same behavior, but the perception is different, and how that behavior is being received is different. And, you know, it might seem like, haha, this is funny, you know, sad that women are receiving this type of feedback. But at high performance levels of sport, at leadership level, this can really impact whether or not someone gets an opportunity for promotion, for example, especially where unconscious bias can exist in selection, hiring processes. Women, you can see how women are much more susceptible to negative outcomes of these unconscious biases compared to men in some of these research pieces. So that's just an example to show how much that can affect the trajectory of a woman's progression or their success in their career compared to men. So with all that said, what can we do to achieve gender equity and better engage women and girls in sport? Okay, not just as participants, but as leaders and in all roles and levels. So as I spoke about earlier, there are many factors, and if it's something that we can change with a silver bullet, we would have fixed it already, right? So it's a complex, it requires a complex change, and change at all levels of the sports system. So let's focus today just on the organizational level. So at the organizational level, as members and leaders of sports organizations, what is within our control and what can we do to change? So in another survey that we conducted recently with national sports organizations in Canada, we learned that almost 90% of NSOs believe that gender equity is important or essential. But the problem is that organizations tend to struggle to understand their gaps and to identify the root causes of these gaps, particularly when it comes to the structural or internal aspects of their organization. There's a lack of clarity and confidence in what to prioritize. You know, there's so many things to do, right? So what do we do first? What steps do we take to create real change? And they find it difficult to independently review, interpret, and apply the myriad of resources and information that is available to organizations on gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. So at Canadian Women in Sport, we seek to be solutions partners to sports organizations. So many of our services and our programs looks to address these challenges at all levels of the sports system in order to help organizations to see a clearer path towards gender equity And so today I'm going to share one of those available tools, understanding that we know that at different levels of the sport, different sizes of organizations require a different level and a tailored type of support. But this is just one available tool that is available online and for free that you can take a look at and share to help you better engage women and girls, but really embed gender equity in the way that you operate so that your initiatives will be sustainable. So in 2017, a few years ago now, we started the development and the piloting for Same Game. So Same Game is a model that outlines a process for embedding gender equity into organizations. And it also highlights the key elements that are required for sustainable systemic change. We were really fortunate to have Dr. Shannon Kerwin from Brock University come on board as our research and evaluation partner to really make sure that our solutions are not only relevant and applicable, but that they are evidence-based, right? And we talk about creating buy-in. You can see on the model there, we have creating buy-in right at the center, because that is often the biggest downfall, is not having that buy-in, but also the biggest critical success factor. And having a really evidence-based approach supports individuals that are sort of spearheading this journey to be able to easily create that buy-in. So Same Game has 7 steps here, as you can see on that diagram on the screen. The first step is creating a gender equity vision. So this involves collaboratively developing a gender equity vision for your organizations to ensure buy-in from everyone involved and commitment to an organization-wide change, right? And the second one, step 2, is collecting data. This allows you to understand your organization's strengths and weaknesses. So when we talk about collecting data, we're not just talking about how many girls and boys are playing our sport. We're also thinking about, what are your processes like? Who are in decision-making positions in your organization? Who sits on the selection panel or the interview panel, for example? And this step is particularly important when it comes to combating unconscious bias, because it allows you to be guided by data and insights from the relevant people with lived experiences, right? Not just relying on your own assumptions and your own attitudes. The third step is then utilizing this data and insights to develop a plan in order to address the identified gender equity gaps, whether that's internal or programmatic or external, and ensuring that your solutions and your activities align with community needs, as well as your overall organizational plan. And then step 4 is communicating your gender equity goals. So this step is about accountability. If you've said you're going to do it, then you're more likely to do it, right? So communicating it internally to garner support, and then publicly to seek input from beyond your organization and from your membership. And then building capacity. This is really important in ensuring that everyone that you're bringing on this journey with you feels like they are well equipped and that they have the relevant knowledge and expertise in order to be successful. Step 6 is implement, right? How many times do we jump straight into step 6 when we think about gender equity, diversity, and inclusion? It's really instinctive to want to jump straight into action, but you can see that there are so many important foundational steps before you get into doing something. So this is where your planning and your data comes to life. And then step 7 is to reflect and revise. So always be monitoring, always be evaluating so that you can recognize what you've done well and continue to seek feedback from those with lived experiences, considering intersectionality, removing bias, and then trying again. We present it in a way that is really linear, but those of you who have tried any of this work will understand that it's not linear. We don't go from step 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and then we start at step 1. Often it's step 1, 2, 3, go back to step 2, 3, 4, you know what I mean, right? So, and I'll share this a little bit later on, is patience is key. And creating buy-in is really important, because garnering buy-in every step of the way is a key success factor in all of this work. So what you see on the screen here is the homepage of the Same Game online toolkit. So we developed an online toolkit that allows organizations to self-guide through a process of advancing gender equity. And we provide things like information, guidance, calls to action, evidence-based resources all along the way to support your journey. It's free for anyone to access, which is why it's really great. We designed this predominantly for clubs and sports organizations that work directly with the community, but it really is a change management process that can be applicable across. And you can, and again, it takes time to go through the toolkit, so it's not completed in one sitting. So because of this, once you've accessed the toolkit, you can bookmark the page and then it will save your progress. So at some point we'll say, you know, go and conduct this activity and then come back and report back. So you can leave the toolkit, you can close it, and then when you come back, you'll remember where you've ended off, as long as you're using the same device and browser. So to give you a sense of this toolkit, we're going to walk through the first step together, which is creating a gender equity vision. And then I encourage you to check out the toolkit and have a flick through some of the other steps as well. I'd also love to see your input throughout. So we're going to be using polls. You're really great in the chat box, so keep doing that. And then we're also going to use Mentimeter. And I'm sure you all have a smartphone in your hand already, probably, or somewhere close by. So if you don't, get your phones ready, but if you don't have your phone close by, that's fine too. I'll give you some options. And then look out for poll questions and prompts for you to respond. On that, let's do another poll question. So this time it's, does your organization have a gender equity vision? Some of you may not have a formal gender equity vision that is published. Some of you do. So yeah, yes, no, or maybe you're unsure. If you say yes, it would be really great if you could share it in the chat. Okay, so I am going to launch a poll here and I'll leave it on for a minute or two. And you can, answer yes, no, or unsure. If you say yes, again, please share it. If you say unsure, it would be great to find out why as well. Maybe it's, you've kind of talked about it, you know generally the direction you're going in, or that you actually don't know if those conversations have been happening. Great, I think about 70% of you have voted. Yep, aspirational vision, 50-50 by 2050. That's great. That's a really specific vision that I'll talk a little bit about later on as well. Awesome. Anyone else with gender equity visions that you are happy to share? I know one that, and Tasia, my colleague that's on the call, will laugh at me. I always share the Sport New Zealand women and girls strategy vision with the organizations that we work with. So that would be awesome to see. I think we have one for high performance, but not sure about the rest of the sport. Yep, that's awesome, which is really interesting, right? In order to have gender equity at the high performance level, you need to have had gender equity at all levels of the sport in order to lead up to that. So, and that's a really interesting conversation always that we're having with NSOs specifically here in Canada. Yeah, Tasia, I do. Always repping the Sport New Zealand gender equity vision. Surf Life Saving is starting to work on one and are building a female leadership network, but still a work in progress. That's awesome. Netball New Zealand starting the journey surrounding male participation within our sport. That's really, really interesting. Great. Word, youth MTV organization, dream big, 50-50 participation by 2025. Establish a strong and permanent women's senior team. Great. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Okay, I'm going to end the polling now. I think most of you have voted. Some of you, 22%, say yes, you do have a gender equity vision, and then mostly no's or unsure. Yep, awesome. And then Tasia sharing ours at Canadian Women in Sport. We aspire to achieve equity for women in society through the power of sport. So that's our gender equity vision. And this is not atypical, right? That's a weird way of putting it. This is typical, is what I'm trying to say. So many organizations tend to overlook the step. In fact, in the first iteration of Same Game, we didn't include the step. It started with data collection as step one, and it was a 6-step process. And it was only through Dr. Kerwin's evaluation of the model that resulted in the addition of visioning, which, just like in any strategic planning process, is important for many reasons, which I'll highlight along the way. So every step starts with an overview page, and this provides a snapshot of what the step entails. So what it is, what the objectives are, why it's important, what you can expect to do, and how much time to allocate, how much time it will take. So this will allow you to anticipate the time and resource commitment for each step and then plan accordingly before you dive into it. So following the overview, you'll see what we talked about before, the academic or the evidence-based grounding as to why the step is important. So this slide here specifically talks about the Noster model, which highlights that having a clear vision is one of 5 essential elements in managing complex change. I didn't want to bore you, so I didn't want to go through all 5 elements here, but encourage you to check out the Noster model. It's embedded into Same Game. So if you want to have a flick through that first section, you'll see what the 4 other essential elements are. And having a clear gender equity vision will also help you get buy-in from key stakeholder groups. How many times can I say buy-in today? So engaging key decision makers in your gender equity efforts right from the start is going to help you navigate any resistance that you're going to experience as you work through the Same Game or the process of embedding gender equity. It's also going to ensure that you have a network of allies that you can rely on through challenging times. We then invite you to anticipate the types of resistance or pushback you might face when developing a gender equity vision. And I'm sure that those of you who have done some work in gender equity or diversity and inclusion, you will be familiar with this, and you'll probably be able to come up with a pretty extensive list of pushbacks or challenges that you might have heard. And it's always good to be prepared with strategies or rationale to respond and create buy-in. So on this page, not only is it an opportunity for you to put those strategies in place to deal with these barriers, but it also provides you with resources and examples. We've heard all the questions, maybe 99.9% of all the pushbacks. So we've gathered our responses, the research that is involved, and we put them all on pages like this all throughout the Same Game toolkit for you to refer to. So I'd love to hear from you again. This time we're going to use Mentimeter. If you've had the opportunity to initiate conversations or initiatives around gender equity or engaging women and girls, what are some of the common pushbacks you've heard? Okay, so that's the question. I know from being in New Zealand earlier this year that y'all are great at scanning QR codes. That's why there's no COVID in New Zealand. So same thing here, use your phone camera and scan the QR code on the screen. Or if you don't have a phone handy, you can open a new tab on your computer or on your browser and then go to mentimeter.com and then enter the code 7235 7820. Okay, so, oh, sorry, let me just double check that because on my screen it says something different. Let's see, 7821, I think is the actual code. But for a safe bet, scan the QR code and then answer the question there. So what are some of the common pushbacks or questions you've heard about gender equity? Okay, so bear with me for a moment while I switch screens. Then we can see all your responses popping up here. Great. Why do we need to focus on girls and women? Yep, exactly. That's hands down the one that we hear all the time. Girls don't want to play, or women don't want to coach is another one that we hear all the time. What about the boys? But the boys need support too. Yeah, working in schools, there's always a focus shift to those already participating rather than understanding. I won't get to all of these, but I think really interesting that we, in the sports sector, and this is in New Zealand and in Canada, we're notorious for only talking to people that already play our sport, right? We survey people in our clubs, we put things on our website and our social media, but if you're not following our social media, how would you see this, right? So I know from my time at Harbour Sport, a lot of the conversation is always about, it's not about bringing the community into our clubs, it's about how can we bring our clubs into the community? How can we make ourselves as sports organizations relevant in the lives of the people who don't naturally play sport? Yeah, why are we dividing society? Reverse sexism is one that we hear all the time. We're not stopping them. There's nothing stopping them to play. They choose not to engage. Yeah, I don't know if any one of you have like your blood boiling reading some of this, but really, but I say that jokingly, but these are really valid questions, right? And again, I won't have time, but if you do have a question that you want me to address or know how we address those questions, again, they're in the Same Game toolkit, but we've allocated a good chunk of time to address them today as well at the end of our session. Okay, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think there's a way where I can save some of these responses, so we can have them ready for reference if we like. Okay, so changing back to our PowerPoint slide here. And so one of the things that we often hear when creating a gender equity vision specifically is we don't want to set a target if we're not going to be able to achieve it, right? Or if we set a target, then it's going to seem like we're pulling resources away from one group and then we're putting it into another. And so the conversation around equity and equality becomes really important to show that, you know, the sports sector is set up traditionally and designed by men for men and boys. And for a long time in history, only men and boys participated in sport. And so again, it's about correcting those historical imbalances and looking at where the needs are the greatest so that we can allocate additional support, allocate additional resources to make sure that we're getting everyone to the finish line as opposed to just giving everyone the same level of support, right? So I think having a really good understanding of that. And also we know that especially with creating a gender equity vision or a target, we know that there are a good number of research that shows that gender equity targets and quotas have really positive outcomes, and organizations that set gender equity quotas that prescribe a minimum number of women's involvement are most likely to affect positive change and promote initiatives to achieve gender equity. And this is especially important in sport because women have very little opportunities to advance in attaining positions of leadership relative to non-sport sectors. So this happens especially in sport when compared to non-sport sectors. And so, you know, what we want to use gender equity vision as an opportunity is to use it as an opportunity to communicate, right? So some of the strategies that we recommend in creating buy-in here is to communicate. So really listen to what they're sharing and use that as an opportunity to find out what the perceived barriers are to achieving gender equity. We want to assure people, right? So assuring people that just because we're working with women and girls doesn't mean we're not working with boys and men. We're just doing a little bit more to correct that historical imbalances. And you know, when it's a question about like, that's too aspirational, right? A vision statement is meant to reflect a big change. There's a saying at Canadian Women in Sport that Alison, our CEO, always says is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So let's set a long-term goal. And then one step at a time, put some small goals in place over a longer period of time to set that path towards the ultimate goal. And then use it as an opportunity to engage. Pushback questions can present opportunities for education and engagement. So invite them into the process, really hear their input, and then find ways that they can contribute. I want to share really quickly something that I've heard through CCDI, the Canadian Centre of Diversity Institute, is looking after the heart, the head, and the hand when creating buy-in. So especially the head, that's where the data, the evidence comes in. The heart, which is empathy, so creating empathy. And then the hand, which is making sure that they have something to do and that they have a hand in this work. And that those three elements are really important in creating buy-in, especially for leaders in the system. So, so this is where we then encourage you to go away and then conduct an activity, right? So we've talked about the importance of vision. We've talked about anticipating pushback. Now this is where you do something about it. So you can see here on the screen that there's a guide that we provide that you can download to support your efforts in this exercise, which includes things like best practice examples, sample questions, and other tips and tricks when developing a gender equity vision. So some of the questions that we suggest when leaders to pose when you're seeking feedback about gender equity visions is, what are your core organizational values? 10 years from now, what is the most important thing you want to accomplish in terms of gender equity? What are some of the issues that you want to change? But also leveraging your strengths. So what are your strengths as an organization, and how can gender equity benefit your organization? And the responses, the more people you ask, the more diverse and gender balanced the group is that you ask, the more it's going to be representative of where you want to be. So this will then help set the stage for you to determine a vision statement that resonates with everyone and one that aligns well with your organizational goal. So this is the point where you're encouraged to step away from the toolkit, implement this activity, and then come back to input your gender equity vision in this box here at the bottom. So your gender equity vision will then show up on the bottom of every page as you go through the same game model. So that just makes sure that you have that vision in mind, that North Star in mind, and that it continues to guide your thinking and planning as you go. So now that you have a gender equity vision, we then encourage you to communicate that vision internally and externally, right? So that you are accountable to committing to making it happen. So communication early and often has been identified by Dr. Kerwin as a very key element to success in affecting change through her evaluation of the model. So opportunities for strategic communication is highlighted again throughout the same game steps, and resources provide you to give you some guidance as to how you can do this. So this level of support and insight is provided throughout the toolkit, where guidance about where to start, what are the key success factors, and the necessary resources are provided all along the way. So while it's a self-guided tool, it's designed to be informative and so that you feel supported throughout your journey to advancing gender equity, from visioning all the way to implementation and evaluation. So now it would be awesome to hear from you again, thinking about either your organization or your sport. What does success look like if we've achieved gender equity? Okay, again, with a Mentimeter, use your phone cameras to scan that, or you can go to mentimeter.com and enter the code on the screen. And the question is, what would your organization or your sport look like if you've succeeded in achieving gender equity? Okay, so again, bear with me as I switch the screen. So I'll give you another moment to scan that QR code before I switch over to Mentimeter. And take your time to think about this, or if you want to just spitball, that's fine too. Okay, hoping that everyone scanned the code. I'm going to switch over. Awesome. What looks like you've succeeded in achieving gender equity. Yep. Some females thriving in the sport at all levels of the game. I might need a bit more of an explanation of that first one, why the program, I guess, is inclusive. Women playing alongside men, more females in leadership roles and execs, not just admin roles. And that speaks to Emily's stat that she shared a little bit earlier before. More diverse communities, more women and girls participating over life in sport and recreation at all levels. Exactly, not needing to have a focus. We're definitely trying to work ourselves out of a job here, so that women and girls don't need to be focused on anymore because equity has been achieved. Equal opportunities for all, 50-50 board representation between male and female premier women's team, more balance. Really great responses here, higher engagement and retention. I think so often our gender equity initiatives focus on recruitment and getting as many people in the door as possible, but how do we get them to stay? How do we create the conditions and the pathways so that they see themselves, they see role models at all levels, and they can relate to being involved at different levels. More accepting in male dominant sports, that's a really big one. Thriving, increased participation with women and girls feeling safe. These are really great, keep them coming. Again, I'm going to save these responses and perhaps if I can figure it out, share it in our follow-up conversation. This is really awesome, thank you for sharing that. So just to wrap up my presentation today before we go into Q&A, and just a thought, I know some of you may have some questions or things have come up. So you can put any questions in the chat right now, and then as we go, we'll address them. We'll collect them and then we'll address them at the end. Okay, awesome. So we recently initiated a project called the Same Game Challenge across Canada, which brings together communities of 10 local sport organizations that are implementing Same Game in their club. So we are just about wrapping up the one that we're doing in Alberta. And I wanted to end my session today by just sharing some key takeaways from the participants of that project who have actively been implementing Same Game. So one of the key things is listening to the data. So one person here said that the areas we expected to approach are not the areas we're realizing we need to approach. So following those steps and making sure that you have all those elements and one step guides the next is really important to ensure that you're constantly checking your own assumptions and biases and ensuring that your programs and initiatives actually meet the needs of your community. Being patient and remaining curious. So it's important to focus on doing things right, even if it means you delay the project a little bit. So systemic change takes time, right? And can often require complex and major changes to the way you've always done things. So recognize that right from the beginning, and then investing the time and resource that deserves in order for it to be a sustainable change. Communication early and often will support buy-in. So people will resist and push back, but with the right approach and support, people will come around. So that's a very optimistic view of that, and it's often true. And last but not least, the importance of applying a gender lens to all areas of the organizations, not just programs. So one person said, learned about the difference between gender equity and equality and how to view our club through a gender equity lens, not just a special project, but embedded as just something that you do as an organization. And so if you're interested in checking out Same Game, plenty of QR codes for you to scan today, but you can go on our website. It's available on there for free in English and French, if you so wish to access it in French. You can go to womenandsport.ca/Same Game and experience it for yourself. You know, I really encourage you to use and share the tool. We're actively encouraging it through our Same Game initiatives, Same Game Challenge initiatives here in Canada. Because we know that systemic change, going back to the ecological model, it requires individuals and organizations, all organizations at all levels of the system, to all work together towards a common goal. So not just the NSOs, not just Sport New Zealand, but everyone at the community, at the regional, at the national level. So really want to invite you along on this journey with us so that together we can achieve gender equity. Another resource, shameless plug here that I'd like to share is our Gender Equity Lens e-learning module. And developing this module was actually my first task at Canadian Women in Sport. So a lot of late nights and sweat in this e-module for me and our team at Canadian Women in Sport. And our aim here really is to create a resource that not only provides information about all things gender equity, but also a framework that allows individuals in the sports sector to apply a gender lens in day-to-day decisions. So you can, again, scan the code or go on our website and look and search Gender Equity Lens to see if that is of interest to you. It's a 1-hour online e-module, and it's 25 Canadian dollars to access per code. So thank you all again for having me today. I'm available now to answer any questions for the remainder of the session, and I'll hand you back over to Emily to facilitate this section.
Awesome, thanks Jenny, that was absolutely amazing. So we gave you all the opportunity to submit questions pre-webinar. We'll discuss one of the questions that came through, and if you have any other questions, please just use the chat function and we'll get to them afterwards. So one of the questions that came through was, what work is being done at national and regional level to provide pay equity for women with their male sport equivalent? As a local organisation, how?
Trying to find that mute button. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And obviously I've been out of the New Zealand sports sector for a little while and probably won't be able to answer your question very directly. But this is a question that we talk about often. So one of the main programs that we offer here at Canadian Women in Sport is the Gender Equity Playbook. And we work predominantly with national sports organizations at this point to assess all levels and all aspects of the organization with a gender equity lens. So one of the key things under the sort of this recruitment, selection, promotion and advancement section of this assessment is pay equity, as well as data collection. And this was a really challenging one because pay equity is always a funny topic, and people don't tend to want to talk about it openly. But what results is that it leaves a lot of room for unconscious bias. It leaves a lot of room for nepotism, for the it's who you know type culture. And it relies a lot on an individual's ability to fight for higher pay, right? If someone is more confident, they are more likely to be paid more because they're more forward in their negotiation. And so what we advise organizations, and in fact, this is a process that we recently undertook at Canadian Women in Sport, is to aim to make pay scales, pay equity, as open and transparent as possible. So that means having really clear and well publicized pay bands that are in line with market pay. So our senior leadership team access a number of reports comparing our organization with the sports system, with the not-for-profit and the general sort of Canadian market, and looked at, at what pay scale do coordinators get paid versus managers versus directors and so on. And then in addition to that is having a really clear performance and compensation framework that shows what are the key competencies objectively that you are looking at in order to progress within the pay bands. So how do you move even as a coordinator, as a manager, how do you move within that pay band? It's not, and making it really clear that it's not by, toughness in negotiation, but actually competency and merit-based, right? So that process removes a lot of unconscious bias and removes a lot of that need of, or reliance on individuals, and creates a process that is transparent and welcoming for, and often the people who are paid less, we know through well publicized that women are paid less and people from equity deserving groups are often paid less. So having those really clear, a really clear competency framework will go a long way in opening up conversations around pay equity. And so this is something that we're encouraging that organizations that we work with do, is firstly conduct a pay equity audit, and then putting things in place to ensure that it's as transparent and as open as possible.
Awesome, thanks, Jenny. Are there any other questions for Jenny while she's here? She has a lot of knowledge to share, so I encourage you to ask anything that's top of mind.
I see in the chat here, Luciana, you've shared a question, but you've shared it to me directly. So I'm not sure if you want to let me know if you're comfortable with me sharing that question, then I can potentially address that, or I can reach out to you directly. Oh, great. Here we go. So an unintended consequence of our gender equity work. Do you have any insights into how do we ensure we can be welcoming and inclusive for rainbow youth when programs are divided into girls and boys only environments? And that's a really great question, and one that we as an organization that has women in the name of our organization, is something that we're constantly trying to explore. Again, be really evidence-based. Oh, sorry, it's Ash Peters from Word. It's really fun. I think, Luciana, you mentioned that wasn't, it wasn't you. So interesting Zoom happenings here. But yeah, so we are engaging with constantly with non-binary folks, LGBTQ advisors that we contract to constantly give us advice on this, as well as to provide up-to-date research to inform our work. And so we recognize that the sports system currently is set up very much for the binary, right? At all levels, maybe not so much at the community levels. Really promising movement that we're seeing here in Canada is that at the community, at the PTSO, provincial, territorial sports organization level, and in many cases, even at the national level, there are very clear transgender inclusion and LGBT inclusion policies, and that organizations are aware that we need to change the status quo about how sport is set up and how binary and exclusive to a lot of gender fluid folks, non-binary folks, for example. So our focus really is in looking at what we can do within the current system, so how the system is set up to ensure that women and girls are best positioned to excel and thrive, but also at a different level, looking to challenge that status quo with research. We need to better understand the research in this space. We need to better engage with non-binary folks, and then really take on board their feedback for us. So in a lot of those cases, it's advocating for gender neutral spaces. It's advocating for gender neutral programs, advocating for removing barriers to, for example, trans inclusion in sport, and making sure that their lived experience are being considered in these decisions, as opposed to often these issues are being looked at in a really dehumanizing way, right? So making sure that their voices are represented around the table is how we're addressing this as an organization.
Awesome. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat. So what are gold star organizations doing that others are not?
Great, awesome. What are gold star organizations doing? I would say that gold star organizations are doing something, and it's intentional, it is resourced, and it is embedded into their overall organizational plan. We often see that, and this is really common. It's not something like bad, you know, but gender equity, diversity, and inclusion is seen as a special project. We've mentioned that before. Is that okay? Well, let's put a women and girls person in that role, and then all the women go to this person, right? Or I don't know, Asanati. I don't want to throw you under the bus, but like, oh yeah, all things Pacific goes to Asanati. Right, and it's kind of, I'm not saying this is the case with Harbour Sport, but a lot of organizations, we see gender equity being seen as a offshoot. But in organizations that we really see a commitment and capacity to advance gender equity is when you see it as a pillar in their strategic plan. You see it reflected in their operational plan, and there's budget allocated to it. And there are people around the table, and there's a committee, and there's a lot of consultations, a lot of advisory committees. So you're looking after all of these aspects, and not just looking at it from a programmatic view. So that's there's many things that sort of progressive organizations are doing in that space, but I would say that is one that is most prominent.
Cool. We've got, in successful implementation of gender equity in organizations that you have seen, what role have males been as allies in the journey? How important is this and why?
Hugely, massively. Thanks, Richard, Mr. Richard Kasut. Really a big role. In fact, on our website, we had a page that we've renamed now, but it was what can men do? We recognize that, yes, we're challenging the status quo. We are working to increasingly help women or break down barriers for women to progress into leadership positions, but recognizing that within the current system, men are still holding a lot of key decision-making positions, and that without their voices, it's going to be really hard for us to create change. So absolutely, men as allies, really important. Oftentimes we hear from men who are in these leadership positions who are our champions. You know, we have a number of male board members on our board. And oftentimes we hear that, oh, you know, I have 2 daughters. I see now that they face a lot of barriers and they come across a lot of challenges. But I also encourage people who perhaps don't have daughters, you don't have lived experience, but looking at the research, looking at the literature, educating yourself in the matters of gender equity, and being able to, you know, have the water cooler, the locker room conversations around gender equity and challenge some of these narratives around, you know, what is this reverse sexism? So everyone taking that individual responsibility of learning more about the topic so that you are better placed to combat some of these narratives that exist in sport.
Just to add on to that question, Richard also asked, is there specific training for male leaders in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I obviously can't speak to New Zealand. We work with one of our advisory committee members is Jake Steeker from Next Gen Men. You can look them up on their website, but they work specifically with men on gender equity issues, recognizing that a lot of the root of gender equity, maltreatment, and sort of exclusion, discrimination stems from toxic masculinity. And it aims to unpack masculinity and redefine masculinity. It's a program that encourages men to come together and explore vulnerabilities, not sort of feed into or also affected by toxic masculinity, and use that as a way to advocate for gender equity. So that's one resource that I can provide. But if anyone, I know, looking at the names, I know a lot of you are gender equity champions in New Zealand. A lot of you have done a lot of work that I've learned a lot from. So if you have responses to some of these questions, or you know of any specific training, I encourage you to share that in the chat as well.
Cool, we've got a couple more questions and then we'll get into the closing. So what are your key takeaways when working with volunteers to convince them to implement the same game process and be patient rather than jumping to it? Often people just want to see something happen.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that that is wrong. I think oftentimes when you jump into just doing something, you see a really good outcome, right? Like, people come in, people are interested in your sport, and then you see a little boost in interest. So I think what we're saying is that don't stop doing those things, but make sure that when you do have a program in mind, or that you are jumping into those things, that you consider these other elements, that you ask questions. And another plug for the gender equity lens is in that thought process of your day-to-day decision, it's about constantly challenging your assumptions. So as you're going into let's just try something, let's just do this, I think this is going to work. Why do you think that? What gave you the idea that it's going to work? Is it your personal experience because you have lived experience or you represent that community? Or do you have to go through a process of seeking more information and speaking to more people, right? And you might go through that process and found that your assumptions were correct, which is great. And then it gives you a lot more information to create buy-in, to say that, yes, I think this will be great. And I have insights from the targeted community. So I think one of the key takeaways is that often that source of intercepting an unconscious bias or intercepting an assumption comes externally. And so the more people in your organizations that are aware of these things and have gender equity, unconscious bias, things like that on their radar, the more likely you are to consider or take the time to consider some of these and test some of your assumptions here.
Awesome. Well, one more question and then we'll finish up. So is gender equity now competing with other priority population agendas? How do you keep it front of mind?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And often it's being done that way because of how funding is being allocated, right? And how, I think a lot of not-for-profit sectors, we look at the money that we have, the funding that we have as a pie, and then it has to be cut in a million different ways in order for everyone to get a piece of the pie. But something that we've been advising organizations to do is invest the time in that sort of exploration phase, the data gathering phase, the vision, and create a plan. Yes, that takes time and resource, but that often doesn't take funding, right? So if you have a really clear plan and a really clear desire for change, then that desire or that diversifying of who you are targeting will open your organization up to further funding opportunities. You're better positioned to align with sponsors, with businesses that might align with your values, with different funders that potentially they don't fund sports. I've had a lot of experience working with Activation at Harbour Sport, where there's a lot of organizations or funders that don't fund sporting initiatives, but they fund development initiatives or settlement support initiatives. So as you have more and more priority groups on your radar, it opens you up to more and more opportunity to grow and expand and seek a more diverse funding stream. So I would say, and maybe that this doesn't directly answer your question, but I would say let's not look at it from a sort of deficit perspective, but let's look at it from, let's create opportunities. The more priority groups you're targeting, the more opportunities, and the broader it is your target audience, target consumers, potential sponsors will be.
Awesome, thanks, Jenny. Darren, just to touch on your question, after the webinar, we'll be sending out a MailChimp, which will have a range of different resources, which kind of goes into the things that keep girls wanting to play at 14, including the woman and girls profile. So you'll have that afterwards to kind of build your knowledge in that space. You'll also, in the MailChimp, we'll have a survey, it will have a link to the recording, a link to the slides so you can download them, a link to Same Game Toolkit if you didn't use the QR code, and then our contact details as well. Sweet, so I'll just pass on to Asanati to close the webinar. I just want to thank you all for being here today. Personally, I got a lot out of this webinar hearing Jenny speak. She's got a wealth of knowledge, so thank you very much, Jenny.
Awesome.
Thank you both.
Good timing. So just the call to action, and Jenny has done an awesome, amazing job, as Emily has said, but it's just that start of acknowledging, and I'm aware that there's different people from the sector, in the organization, in your organization, whether it's grassroots or whether it's elite, but it's just acknowledging, and I guess that's the first step for us, is building your knowledge and understanding, letting the data inform what you do. And for me, it is a call for representation, but also a call for justice. And we can go throughout the sector and say justice for DNI, justice for this and that, but it's really acknowledging that where we're at as an organisation, or where you're at as a person, as Jenny has also said. And then there's toolkits, like Jenny has said. So build your knowledge and understanding depending on where your organisation is at. Reflect and evaluate. Some of you might already be there. In that reflect and evaluation stage, and then determine your starting goals. So if this is all new, there are things out there, and Emily and myself are here at Harbour Sport, and we can help you with that journey, because we are aware and acknowledge that everybody's at different scales of their journey with this gender equity. So as Emily said, she'll send the information out on the MailChimp. And yeah, that's it from us. I'm going to close this off in a karakia with 5 minutes to spare. So thank you so much once again, and let us pray. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki a hiuku karaiti, me te aroha e te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairoa tapu, ake, amine. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.